Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Christy Lowe, and I'm really glad you're back with us today. Today, I'm sitting down with my guest, Jay Kim. Jay is a pastor of a church in the Silicon Valley, WestGate Church. He and his wife, Jenny, have two kiddos, and Jay is the author of several books. He is a really incredible thinker, but what makes a good communicator in my mind is someone who can take a really complex thing and then break it down into simple terms that make it digestible and understandable. We're going to talk today about syncretism. And syncretism is not as complex as you would think it would be. If you can understand the concept of Chipotle and that restaurant, you will understand syncretism. So hang in there for that reference. And so I say this a lot, but I really mean it. You guys are in for a treat. We're talking about everything under the sun today. Moana even makes a cameo in today's episode. So definitely a whole lot of things that we are talking about, but it is an honor and a privilege to introduce you to Jay. And I think you are going to really enjoy getting to know him, learning from him. So we'll link those resources for you in the show notes if you would like to go find Jay Kim and connect with him in other places. Make sure that if you are not subscribed to my newsletter, go to evenifpodcast.com, scroll halfway down, and that will take you to a link where you can sign up for my newsletter, send it out once a week, send out information, good things that are going on around the podcast, some opportunities that are coming later this spring and summer. And if you have not connected with me on social media, go find me, stop by and say hello, and I would love to have you part of the Even If family. Let's go ahead and get started today. It's such a rich conversation. I really hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for being here today, guys. And I will cut you to my conversation with Jay Kim. Here you go. Welcome, Jay Kim. I am so very glad that you are here today.
Yeah, really glad to be on with you.
Well, thanks. Well, we've kind of got a gamut of things. I think I could ask you questions all day. So I'm going to try to restrain myself. But before we kind of jump in, I'm very curious. How did you end up in ministry? That's one thing I have not found that. So how did you end up in working in ministry and doing this?
Yeah, great question. I grew up going to church. I'm the son of a Korean immigrant mother, and so I grew up going to a handful of uh, Korean immigrant churches. And in immigrant culture, churches are much more than, an hour and 15 minutes on a Sunday where you sing songs and listen to a sermon. Churches become really the social hub or the social epicenter of your life. It's the place where immigrants feel belonging and connection in a land that's very foreign and alien. So I grew up at church all the time. I was at church, 4 days a week with my mom in various capacities. Grew up in the sort of 90s evangelical
Yeah.
youth culture, kind of,
Yep.
subculture. And so I grew up listening to Jars of Clay on the weekend and
Oh,
Pearl Jam
yes.
and Nirvana on the weekdays, kind of thing, that whole strange dichotomy that you go through.
Yes.
So anyways, I was a church kid and thought I was really involved, and I thought that meant I had this really rich, robust faith in Jesus. But then my freshman year of college, when the infrastructure of my youth group and all of those things was removed from my life, my faith came crumbling down. I went through what today is now sadly a very common sort of deconstruction of faith
Yeah.
season of my life, which I don't necessarily think is bad as long as you have the sort of rubble with which you can reconstruct. So that's what happened with me. I deconstructed my faith, walked away from not just the church, but from Jesus and all of it for a handful of years. And then in my very early 20s, um, long story short, my life had sort of run into a brick wall and everything came crumbling down. And I just found myself hopeless, honestly. But then there was a group of guys several years older than me. I'd grown up with them at church, but I they'd always sort of stayed in touch with me, even though I walked away from my faith, and always extended so much love and care. And um, again, long story short, but they started inviting me to this Monday night guys hangout thing.
Yeah.
We would just, eat dinner and play video games and watch movies and football. And um, but then we would hang out long into the night, 1 or 2 a.m. And eventually every Monday night, those hangouts would lead to conversations about the deeper stuff of life. And they really invited my questions and my doubts and all of those things. So that journey led me back to the church, which led me back to Jesus. And all of these guys they were volunteer leaders in the youth group at the church.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I just, I admired them so much. I got to a place where I really thought, like, they seem to have so much joy and life and purpose and meaning. Maybe I should just try to do some of the stuff they're doing. So I had come back to Jesus at this point, and eventually I decided, I'm going to volunteer as a small group leader in the youth ministry as well. So I started in my early 20s. I started leading a middle school boys small group, and that changed my life, not because I had any answers for these kids, but their questions were really like my questions. And I found
Yeah.
myself journeying deeper in my faith with them. And
Mm.
that turned into, man, I think this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I dropped out of the state university that I was attending at the time, where I was studying business. And I enrolled at a small Christian college here in town, and became a youth pastor at a church in town, and that
Yeah.
was 20 something years ago, and here we are.
Wow. That is cool. I did not know any of that. That is amazing. And also, I used to teach junior high, so I know junior high boys, and they
Oh
will
yeah.
absolutely refine your faith and
Yeah.
challenge you to look for Jesus in a
Yeah.
million ways.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
so cool. That is amazing. I love that. I love that you said that you could just that you from that rubble. And we are my kiddos are 17 and 20, and
Mm,
I have a daughter in college. And we've watched her faith evolve from the high school faith into an adult relationship with Christ,
yeah.
and that's been beautiful. But
Mm,
so, but we know the statistics on how many kids 18 they walk away and they never come back. And
yeah.
so, thank you, Jesus, that you did and that you're here today. And
Mm,
you have written you have such a beautiful mind in the way that you present thoughts and write, and you've authored several books. The one that I would love to talk about a little bit today is the most recent one that's been released. We're going to talk about the other one that's coming shortly,
yeah.
but you wrote a book about Colossians, a
Mm,
study of Colossians, and the book of Colossians has a lot of similar veins to today.
yeah.
Can you talk about that just for a minute? Like, how can explain to my listeners about Colossians and what their culture and their background was like, and then and let's kind of go from there.
Yeah. 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 The book of Colossians that we find in the New Testament was a letter
Mhm.
written by the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
He's writing to the early Christians in this city, Colossae. It's in modern day Turkey, about 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. At the time, it was really famous for clothing manufacturing. In particular, they would manufacture this sort of dark red wool, which was actually called Colosseum, after the city, Colossae.
Uh-huh.
And that was kind of the industry of the day. And because there was money to be made there, Colossae, uh, it became sort of a hub for people. So the city itself was pretty diverse. And there were a number of people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds who made their way to Colossae. And the city itself was moderately important at the time of Paul, but it ends up being one of the places where the Christian movement really takes hold, and Paul's work there really has great effect.
Mhm.
And at the same time, they face some challenges. So because it was such a diverse city, um, it was also diverse religiously. So we have to remember, 2,000 years ago in the ancient, in the Near East, everybody was religious. It wasn't like today where religion is on the decline in the modern West. It's like everyone had a religion, but there were a wide variety of religions. So Colossae was a city where traditional Judaism really flourished, but it flourished alongside other local religions, smaller local religions, as well as the larger pagan religions of the Roman Empire. And so, because it was so diverse, this new Christian movement that was taking hold in Colossae, it was attracting people who were bringing with them all of their history and all of their stories and traditions. And because the Christian movement was so new, um, uh, both Jews and Gentiles were bringing into their newfound commitment to Jesus all of this other stuff
Mm-hmm.
from their previous religious traditions. So perhaps more than any other city at the time, Colossae was really prone to what's called syncretism, which is just a big fancy word that describes like the fusion of a variety of beliefs and practices from diverse religious traditions. So you can almost think of it as like the Chipotle of religion, like you go to Chipotle and you're like, do I want the burrito or the rice bowl, brown rice or white rice? Do I want, like which
Yeah,
meat do
like
I want?
picking and choosing. Right.
Exactly. And so, what Paul is trying to do in this letter to the Colossian Christians is address that reality. He's essentially saying, listen, the Jesus movement is not Chipotle. You cannot bring like some beans from this faith tradition, and some lettuce from this one, and some cheese from that one, and create the bowl of your Christian faith to your own liking. That's not how it works. He's essentially pointing to the reality that, Jesus himself says in the Gospel of John in chapter 14, when Jesus says, listen, Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. Paul is really highlighting that fact. Like, you
Mhm.
do not get to pick and choose. You don't get to sort of create your own version of Christianity with all of the sort of cultural baggage that works for you sprinkled in. That's not how it works. The Christian movement is built on faith and trust and allegiance in Jesus alone. And to me, what was so interesting about studying the book of Colossians, Paul's letter, was that I see the same thing happening today. So many
Yes.
followers of Jesus in the modern world who sort of take this Chipotle approach to Christianity. They sort
Yes.
of create and craft a faith to their liking, that has we create and craft an image of Jesus where he essentially supports all the things we support. He
Mm.
has political leanings that we have. He has anger and vitriol toward those people that we have anger and vitriol toward. But
Wow.
when you read the Jesus stories, what is very clear right away is that he is drawn to the people and the places that the most religious people of the day wanted nothing to do with. And what you realize very quickly about Jesus when you read his story is that he's quite uncomfortable, and
Mm.
his intention is not to make us comfortable, but to invite us, in his own words, to die to ourselves, to take up our cross and to follow him and him alone. And I think Paul is trying to reiterate that point in his letter to the Colossians. And for me, I just feel like, man, that is a word for us today.
It is absolutely. And I will confess to every listener out there and to you, J. Kim, that I had to look up the definition of syncretism whenever I first was introduced to it. I was listening, this was several months ago. I'm listening to a podcast, a real heady theological discussion you were having with somebody else. And I stopped and I Googled it because I was like, I want to know more about what syncretism is. And the more I read about it, And the more I listen to you talking about how it's this Chipotle, I love that imagery, just for the record.
Yeah.
This I the more that you try to mash it up and pick and choose what Jesus believes in or what he, approves of, etc., the more
Yeah.
I saw our current culture and our
Yeah.
current I began to read Colossians through the lens of this began to feel like a warning to me as a believer living in the United States today, and the way that we have begun to pick and choose and use Jesus as a political, um almost like a like he's on my side, like trying
Yeah.
to win it. And I don't necessarily want to talk about too much politically, but what I do want to ask you this is, I think that there's a danger to syncretism.
Mm.
But in your mind, why is syncretism dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, it's dangerous because it's not the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
Um, this is kind of offensive to say in a culture that is as hyper individualistic and autonomous as ours. But Jesus is not interested in I don't want to get like I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm just gonna say it and you
uh,
can edit it out. Jesus is not interested in giving us our version of what we think our best life today, right now, could and should be. He's
Amen.
not, I mean, we are not the architects of flourishing and meaning and purpose. And I think the data bears that out. We have more control, more autonomy, more individualism, at least for most of our listeners here today. We have, whether we feel it or not, compared to human history and compared to the majority of the world, we live with more excess and more resources. And, we're surrounded by more ingenuity and creativity and technology and on than any other generation of humans before us. And yet, what do the statistics tell us? They tell us that we are lonelier than ever. We're sadder
Isolated.
than ever. We're more isolated than ever. We are seeking desperately meaning and purpose and joy in ways that other generations of humans before us never had.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Well, it means like this great human project of human progress and, whatever, like that we can forge our own way toward this great, beautiful, global utopia. It's a lie. It's a myth.
Yeah.
Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Like he is the one who architects and architectures a life of meaning and purpose and joy. And the path there is paradoxically so, it is the path of laying ourselves down,
Yes.
surrendering our preferences and our own sort of personal whatever to the way of Jesus, which is the way of love, a life of receiving God's love and extending that love back to God and to one another and our neighbors and those in need. I mean, that is the life of flourishing that Jesus offers. And so yeah, it's not an easy pill to swallow, but it is, like the
No.
old Matrix movies, like, man, once you see it, you can't unsee it, but it's reality and it's really beautiful, if you
Yeah.
can take that leap of faith.
Yeah. Well, and when you talk about you saying that about how it is, it's just laying down our life. It's about, I think the danger is that we have developed, for lack of a better way to put it, like a Christian nationalism,
Mm,
where, we're using it. And I think that what we're pledging our allegiance to, what we are saying, that we are holding up as our idol. Um, well, let me rephrase that. I think sometimes we can pledge an allegiance to something that can become an idol to us.
yes.
And what I hear you saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is you're saying, you know, it's about living this life of laying it down to him and saying, I want what you want, and I don't
Yep.
have to pick and choose. And Chipotle. this
Yeah.
religion, because at that point it becomes religion. It's not a
Yeah.
relationship, it's religion. And
Right.
and I think that that's what drives a lot of people out of the church and out of fellowship with other believers, is because
Mm.
religion is getting in the way of our relationship with actually developing a relationship with Christ.
Yeah.
And I think that's dangerous. That's dangerous. Um,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, I wonder, how would you suggest, maybe there's somebody sitting here and this might be a really deep conversation for some of you. Some of my friends here may be going, okay, so what do I do with this?
Mm.
What do I do with this? How do we recognize this in our own lives? And then the second part of that would be, how do we resist it?
Yeah. That's so good. Um, there's this writer, he's passed on now. Many of your listeners will know him, but his work has been so influential in my life, Dallas Willard. And
Oh
he's got
yeah.
this great quote about wisdom. He says that wisdom is the settled disposition of the soul to act in accordance with knowledge. So I'll say that again. Wisdom, Willard says, wisdom is the settled disposition of the soul to act in accordance with knowledge.
Mm,
And the reason that's so important is because I think today most of us think wisdom is just knowledge. We think the wise people in our midst are the people who know the most, particularly in the digital age or the information age. In
hmm.
the sort of TED Talk culture that we live in, we
Yes.
watch the 7 minute TED Talk on global warming or whatever, and we think to ourselves, I know everything there is to know about global warming. And then we move on with our day and do absolutely nothing about global warming, as an example. That's not a political statement about global
Yeah.
warming, by the way.
Sure.
It's just
Sure.
an example of how we live. Like we just fill our minds with knowledge
Hmm.
and think that because we know more, we are more. Um, and I think one of the risks of even listening to or watching a podcast like this, for those who are listening and watching, is like, oh my gosh, that I know some stuff now about the book of Colossians or about the context or the whatever. And it's really important that we remember, like, that's knowledge. What you have now is a little bit more knowledge, but it's not wisdom. Wisdom is the settled disposition, the non anxious disposition to move toward action, to take whatever knowledge you have and to say, well, what does that mean for my life? What does it mean for the world? And what am I to do? And then to do it, to do the thing
Actually
that
go and do it.
yeah, yeah. So, if we're talking about syncretism, so maybe someone's listening or watching right now, and the thought is coming to you like, okay, how have I sort of chipotle'd my faith? Oh, well, you know what? I really judge these people in my church because on Facebook they post X, Y, and Z, and it's so stupid or it's so wrong, or how could they be so misinformed or whatever, on and on and on. Well, to know that like that perspective, if something strikes you right now, is like, okay, that perspective, even that is like maybe it's syncretism on my part that I think or feel the way I think or feel about those people
Mhm.
because I've sort of syncretized my own faith. Like I am so drawn, like I'm so repulsed by those sorts of whatever political leanings or otherwise. Maybe it's because I've sort of done the same without, a deep awareness of it. So maybe that's happening. Well, that's knowledge. That's not actual wisdom. Wisdom would be to ask the question, what am I to do? And maybe what we are to do is to lean in and to not just judge digitally, but to ask the person if they want to have a cup of coffee and ask them like, hey, tell me more of your story. Like
Mhm.
why I'm so curious. Like you seem really emboldened and impassioned by these sorts of issues. As a follower of Jesus, I'd love to hear like more. And typically, when we listen to people's stories, like when we really lean in relationally, what I found in my experience is all of my judgmentalism just gets totally deconstructed because I
Yes.
begin to realize, like, oh, this is not just like some person who has a weird political leaning. This is a mother or a father or a son or a daughter who has a
Yeah,
backstory, and their leaning is what it is because of their story, because of
absolutely.
hardship or pain that they've experienced, or things that have been done to them, or
Yeah.
ways in which they've been marginalized or ostracized that I was just grossly unaware of, you know? So that would be wisdom, to actually take action, to act in accordance with the knowledge, and to do something about uh, this growing self-awareness of how the Spirit of God might be convicting you. So yeah, I think that would be my encouragement.
Yeah.
Take the knowledge and then prayerfully engage with God by his Spirit and ask the question, God, what am I to do? And give me the courage and the faith and the trust to actually do it, you know?
Yes, yes. Well, and to that point, as you're saying that, I think whenever we see people in our circle or on social media that have entirely different, vantage points or ways of living, politically or not, just the way that they're living, whenever we begin to, when we come into their world and sit
Mm,
beside them or sit across a table from them and have a cup of coffee, it's real easy to dehumanize people from afar. It's
yeah,
real hard to not see someone's humanity when you look them in the eyes and you
yep,
know their story.
yep.
And I like to say that everybody has a story and every story has a purpose.
Mm,
And I think a lot of times, I think that's part of what started this whole podcast is that
mm,
I think that everybody's got a story.
yep,
And there's a reason why that person is so outspoken about that particular issue or that particular thing. And there's
yeah,
a reason why. And so like to your point, yeah, there's just I think it's sad that we so dehumanize people and stand on the sidelines instead of just getting to know them or
yeah,
asking the question, like get a little closer. They're not going to bite you. I mean,
yeah.
they might bite, but I mean, we've got our rabies shots, so we're good. Um, I'm just kidding.
That's right.
We're about to switch gears because I just am dying to talk to you about your new book that's about to come out. But before we wrap up there, am I missing anything about that? Is there anything you want to add about that?
No, I mean, I think my encouragement would just be, whether you check out the study that I created or not, I would just encourage people, like, read Colossians. It's a
Yes.
short read. You can read the whole
Yeah.
thing, and it's very quick. Man, and I just think if you read with open eyes and open hearts and open ears and open minds, the Spirit of God has some really, really profound things to say through that letter today.
He does. I agree. And that's why I was so excited to talk to you about that. Oh, I'm trying to leave it. I want God to use, I never want to like force feed or feed somebody something to try to make them feel a certain way. That's never the intent of this
Yeah.
space. But I want to leave that there for
Mm,
let the Lord direct you wherever this conversation is prompting in your spirit. And that's our prayer for this is that he would use this to reveal himself to you
mm,
somehow, because I think we all do it unintentionally. I don't think it's
yeah.
necessarily conscious. We all have our own like microcosm and little cultures within our world and the way that we are raised and the faith. And so just examine that.
Yeah.
But switching gears, you've written a new book called Listen, Listen, Speak.
Mm.
It's coming out April 16th. So here just in a couple of weeks from when this will go out into the world. I gotta ask, I can I just want to ask you this. Where did this book come from? What prompted this?
Yeah. Um, yeah, we live in a really noisy world. So I
I
wrote the
do.
book mostly because I found myself really struggling in recent years. I mean, really my whole life in many ways, but uniquely struggling in recent years, to turn the volume down on all of the cultural and media, social media and news media noise, as well as just the voices in my own head.
Yeah.
Um, I've found it really challenging to create the sort of necessary quiet space and place in my life to hear the voice of God, which is the
Mhm.
voice that really matters. I found myself really utterly confused at times, like, oh gosh, is that God's voice or is that the voice of culture or my own voice, which has been sort of overly saturated in news media and social media and my own
Hmm.
insecurity and just I really, really found it hard, and painfully challenging to hear the voice of God and I just found myself exhausted by all of it, by all of the
Yeah.
chaos and the cacophony and just the
Hmm.
noise of it all. So I felt like there had to be some sort of way forward that was not as noisy,
Yeah.
where I could, you know, create a framework and practices in my life that would help me hear more clearly the voice of God and to live less frenzied and less sort of tossed back and forth by all of the chaos in culture.
Hmm.
So I wrote the book because of that. I wrote it as a
Yeah.
sort of self-reflective guide for myself, really, hopefully. Like, how can I hear the voice of God? And obviously the hope is that it would be helpful to some people as well.
Yeah. Most of the time, books that have affected me the deepest are ones that came from someone else's profound experience or pain. And so when we
Mm,
write from that place of knowing that there's got to be it's got to be better than this. There's got to be a better way to do it than this.
mm,
And we're so busy. And I think busy has actually become a word of like a badge of honor.
yeah.
Like, oh yeah, I'm so busy. Well,
Yes.
when you're so busy, you can't hear anything. You can't even think. That's truth. Um, when you wrote this book, Listen, Listen, Speak, tell me about what you discovered in this process. Like what changed in your life?
Yeah. Yeah. The title of the book is what it is because big picture, high level, what I discovered was that in large part, one of the reasons it was so hard for me to hear God or to hear anything with any level of clarity was because the cultural moment we're in sort of subtly and insidiously tells us that speaking is more important than listening. And it's one of the reasons why I discovered like this is why everything's so noisy. It's not just all of the noise around, it's that I have lost the ability or the aptitude for listening well. So, um, to me, that's the first discovery and maybe the most important one. We just have to learn how to become a listening people again. I think most often we listen for the voice of God when we think we need the voice of God. And I think the shift that's required to actually hear God through the noise is not to listen for him when we think we need him, but to become a listening people, to be the sort of person who walks through life um, curious, on a journey, on a search for the voice of God all the time, everywhere in all of life. Like, what is God saying as I sit here at this red light and boredom is taking hold and everything in me wants to just flip through my phone,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
jump to the next podcast or whatever. And instead, to be the sort of person who says, in the midst of all the noise, what is God saying? Is God saying anything here? Like, the Samuel words, speak, Lord, your servant is listening, to
Yes.
make that the mantra of our lives. I think that's probably the primary lesson, the most important lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are obviously practices to be able to try to do that well, but yeah, to me that's of maybe utmost importance if we want to become a person who can, shut the volume down, turn the volume down on all of the noise competing for our attention.
Hmm. I find the irony that we're doing a podcast here where both of us are speaking and listening at the same time.
Yeah.
And you're in a ministry where your primary job is to speak.
Yeah.
And so I can see where that would wear you out. I mean,
Mm,
eventually you're going to be like, I've always got to be the one talking and I've always got to be the one having the answers. And
yeah.
or people are coming to you, asking you the questions and you've got So I think that there's got to be this place where we have to just stop and create that space. We got to have
Yeah.
space in our lives. I think we have so little space.
Yes. That's
Um,
exactly right.
how do we, can you hear my dog, by the way? I can hear, there's an ambulance going by.
No, no,
Okay,
I don't
good.
hear
You
anything.
can't,
Yeah,
if
it's
you
great.
can't hear it, then it's not picking up.
Yeah.
There's an ambulance going by, and I have a sweet dog who has to howl along. I've decided that it's like he's just praying along. He's like
Yeah,
praying for
yeah, that's
whoever's in it.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right.
So anyways, he's kind of the mascot on our podcast. He makes cameo appearances regularly.
Oh, that's
Um,
awesome.
how, you talk about, we, instead of flipping through our phone, we stop and you know, we just sit and say, okay, God, what are you saying? Can I tell you what happened last night?
Please, yes.
So last night I could not sleep. And I think I mentioned that to you before we started the show. I just couldn't sleep last night. And I wasn't really anxious about anything. I've recently had surgery, and so I'm just not sleeping great at night.
Mm,
But
mm.
last night, in an effort to try to turn off my brain, sometimes, don't laugh at me, but every now and then I will just turn on a Disney movie, because it's like, those movies that your kids watch like all the time, and you can fall asleep to it because you know the movie. You're just gonna,
Yeah.
like, it's just like ambient noise. So I turn on Moana. Okay. This is
Yeah.
this is super random. I promise this is going somewhere, J Kim. I promise. So there's a song in the show, and I'm trying to fall asleep here. And there's this phrase where she's talking about, what is wrong with me, because she's trying to figure out who she is.
Mm,
And it struck a chord. And she says, what is wrong with me? And I said to the Lord, Lord, that's how I feel a lot of times. Why am I so weird? Why am I the one who's always asking the questions? Because I'm a really curious person. It's kind of it's a habit, but it's a good thing, I think, because
mm,
that's the way the Lord has made me. But um it felt like there was something defunct within me or wrong.
mm,
And I said to him last night, I just said, what is wrong with me? What's wrong with me? Got out my
mm,
computer, I start writing because that's the way I process things.
mm,
And then, because I can't sleep, I turned off Moana, because now I'm just like, now Jesus and I are having time. And so I go to your website because I'm interviewing you today, and I see one of your recent sermons was like from about a week before Christmas, I think. And so I
mm.
think, all right, I'm just going to watch this. It didn't put me to sleep. I watched the whole thing, just for the record. To your congregation, anybody who needs props, it was really incredible. But there's a point in there where God used you last night, and He just said,
Mm,
because in your sermon you said um, that you're a child of God. There's
mm,
nothing wrong with you, Christy. And
mhm,
God just begins to pour into me.
mm,
There's nothing wrong with you.
mm,
I made you exactly how I wanted you to be. And
mhm,
I thought it was so gorgeous how God used you,
mm.
recorded, to say, you're a child of God. That's who
Yeah.
you are. That's your identity. But in that, so I get done with that, and then I go on something else, and I realize that you have this new book called Listen, Listen, Speak coming out.
Mm,
And I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to talk to him about this.
mm,
And I realized that I probably would have gotten that answer so much sooner if I had slowed down to listen.
mm,
And we're so busy looking for the answers in other places. And
mm,
so I know this is a long winded story to say God is using you in a really powerful way. Um,
mm,
but he specifically did it last night. How then, what's the one thing, if you can just tell me one thing, what's your one thing that we can go about learning to hear the voice of God
mm,
better?
mm. Gosh. Well,
You
first of all, I'm thank you for sharing that story. It's really encouraging to me, and it really has very little to do with me. I think the way,
Holy
you know, it's
Spirit.
that is like God, right? To
Yeah,
take something
absolutely.
random and to speak through
Yes.
it, everything.
Yes.
I think this is true of this podcast that you're creating, of anything I do, whether it's a sermon or a book or whatever. It's all just stuff that we offer to God on the altar, and ask and plead that he uses it to do, the stuff that only he can do. My sermon didn't really do that. It was God using a thing that I
Absolutely.
made to
Yeah.
do the thing that only God can do. So I'm really grateful for that. Gosh, to respond to the question, there's so many thoughts that come to mind, but just thinking about the story you just shared, because I think one, I can relate on a personal level. Anything I create, including that sermon, is really, I'm trying, it's just a prayer. It's like, it's for
Yes.
me first and foremost. Because I
Yes.
need that reminder too. Often I'm like, oh gosh, what's wrong with me? And how come
Yeah.
I don't know if people are familiar with the Enneagram on your podcast, but like
Oh, yes.
I'm an Enneagram 3, so I'm constantly sort of aware of
Ah,
like, oh, I've
okay.
got to be, like I have to impress people and whatever, like
Hmm.
my own insecurities and all that. So,
Achievements and
yeah,
oh,
all of
yes.
that.
Hmm.
So for me, it's interesting. I guess one of the things I would say along those lines in terms of becoming the sorts of people who listen, who can hear God, I think it's really important that we grow in our awareness, whether we feel the reality or not. Just grow in the faithful awareness that God sees us where we are all the time, that He's closer than we could possibly imagine.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons that's so important is we live in an influencer culture, is
Yes.
like this growing tide of social
Yeah.
media influencers, which we've never had. I mean, we've had versions of this before, previous iterations, um historically, but we've never had it like this,
Hmm.
where because of the smartphone in particular, but just social media in general, people everywhere have this thought like, oh, I can get into the hearts and minds of the masses around the world. I mean,
Hmm.
literally, it's not just celebrities who think this, it's 12-year-olds who will
Yes.
tell you, what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, I want to be
An
famous.
influencer. Yeah.
Like, what does that mean? For what? It's like, I
Yeah.
don't know. It's like I've got Instagram, so I can. So
Sure.
therefore I want, which is a bypassing of offering something of value to the world, which is always
Hmm.
how it worked before. You only gained influence culturally if you actually offered something of value to the world. But because of the smartphone and social media now, if you if you know how to take good photos of yourself, like you can be an influencer,
Yeah.
so it's that's so crazy to me. But one of the things that's happening is it's pushing us toward um life as a performance, like literally all the time, 24/7.
Yes.
We're
Absolutely.
constantly performing, we just like something has shifted in us where because we believe that the world is watching, we are performing all the time. There's this story, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has this line. He basically says like, hey, listen, when you practice your righteousness, says this interaction, he says, when you practice your righteousness, um be careful not to practice it in front of others to be seen by them.
Yeah.
And that phrase, to be seen, is actually this Greek word, theatanai, from which we get the English word theater.
Hmm.
So it's basically what Jesus is saying
The
is like,
show.
dude, stop performing. Stop
Yes.
trying to present yourself a particular way. Just be you
You.
humbly and honestly and genuinely, and offer that to God and watch as he uses it to
Mm.
encourage and to bless others. Because if you can do that, man, that's the life of meaning and purpose and joy that we're all after. And it's so interesting because um, he he makes that point alongside the entire Sermon on the Mount, which the whole thing is about, what people call the upside down kingdom of God.
Yes.
It's like,
Yes.
to be seen is not the thing. It's to see. Can you see those in need and give yourself? It's all that kind of stuff over and over
Yes.
again. But Jesus also does not ignore the innate human need to be seen. Like we want to be seen.
Yeah.
But he answers that question by essentially saying, like, listen, God sees you. He says in that same story, he's like, because your Father in heaven who sees you. We
Mm,
lose that, like we lose the
yes.
power of that because we think what that means is like, oh, God is watching us, so I shouldn't
Yeah.
be performative. That's
Yeah.
not what he means. What he means is stop performing for the world to be seen by them because you're already seen. Like your
Yes.
father that means like you are his son, his
Yes.
daughter. He sees you. He
Yes.
sees you the way a loving dad sees their child all the time. We were talking
Mhm.
before this podcast. My family just went on a little family vacation out of the country. And so we're in this, foreign country. It was a beautiful experience. But I've got two young kids. My daughter is 8, my son is 5. So they're a handful,
Yeah.
especially my 5-year-old son. And we were there with family, so he's got a cousin who's like his best friend, and they're the same age. So we're
Yes.
walking around this foreign country. It's like beautiful, so much to see, but like they're going nuts. They're running everywhere, um and they don't see me because they're just lost in play. But I
Yes.
had my eye on them the whole time, just to make sure, like, are they safe? Are they okay?
Sure.
And that's God with us. Like, you don't have to perform. You're already seen. God sees you. Like, his eye is on you all the time. And
Yeah.
if he sees you, that means that the moment you turn and look to him, his eyes are already locked with yours, which means he's listening. He hears you, your pain, your anguish, your sense of, isolation or loneliness, or
Sure.
the feeling of being forgotten or lost in the midst of all the chaos or whatever. Like, you're not lost. God sees you. And I think that reorientation of our lives that we are already seeing is maybe one of the vital steps toward living a listening life. Um, it is easier to hear God than you might think because his eyes are already locked in on you. And if you
Mm.
would turn to see him, then you'll hear him.
Yeah.
It's just the question is, will you turn to see him?
Yeah. Well, I think just like last night, what I shared with you, it was a matter of saying, why do I think something's wrong with me? Why did I
Mm,
believe that? Like when you ask him that question or give him the insecurity of your life or the struggle or the pain, he already sees it. He already
yes.
holds it. And
Yep.
it's a matter of, and I'm not acting like I have all the answers. Please do, because I mean, I'm the one who just told you that I was the one who going, what's wrong with me? Why am I so
Yeah.
weird? So I mean, like,
Yeah.
but I do, but when he met me in that moment and then spoke so very tenderly.
Mm,
I'm a writer, but like that's the way I process. And so to sit and just I let him say, "You're okay. You're good.
yeah.
You're who
Yep.
I've made you to be." Literally, like Esther, for such a time as this.
Mm,
There's a flip side to this, and I just want to ask you one more question before we wrap up, because I'm sure you have other things to go on with your day and do. But there's gonna come a point where we're it's listen, listen, speak. So if I'm guessing, it's we got to listen more than we talk. But
mm,
when we do speak, how do we speak in such a way that other people can hear us?
yeah. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. I mean, the whole second half of the book is about that. And
I can't wait to read it.
yeah, yeah. I think it's important that we don't just start talking. I think often, especially in our day and age, we're reactive.
Yeah.
Something happens or someone says something and we react. Sometimes it's the sort of the pressures of virtue signaling. Something happens and
Oh
I
God.
have to talk. I have to talk. Otherwise, it is going to be assumed of me that I am not virtuous. And I think
Yes.
we have to relinquish our that sort of innate desire to wade into the cacophonous waters, the noise, because
Hmm.
if I don't, I'm just gonna get
Oh my
whatever. Like
gosh. Well, you're
we've got to
chasing.
lose. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've got to stop. Like we just have to stop. Like, the saying something first is not the most important thing. But
Yes.
that's how we
Amen.
feel.
That is right.
Um, Listening is the most important thing, and then responding, not reacting. So I think we have to, before we say anything, we have to always ask ourselves a couple of questions like, why am I speaking? How am I speaking? And
Mhm.
then this is a question that gets lost a lot. Like, where am I speaking? Like, where am I speaking from
Mm.
specifically?
Okay.
And what I mean by that is because of modern technology, I don't know if anyone's read this book. It's like a 40-year-old book, but if you have not read it, I would encourage everyone to read it. Not a Christian book, but Neil Postman, who was a 20th century writer and social commentator and sociologist. Neil Postman wrote a book in the 80s called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he's really
Whoa.
talking at the time, he's talking about television media and news media. But if you read it today, even though the book is 40 years old or something like that, you will think he wrote it yesterday
Yeah.
because the points he makes are so prescient. Like it's crazy. Basically, the point he makes is this is one of the points he makes is that before the telegraph machine, information was always local, meaning if you got the news, it was always local news. And actually, for the majority of human history, it was like hyper local. The
Like
news you cared about wasn't
little
even
bitty.
like about the state or your city. Like most of the time, it was news about your neighborhood or your
Yeah.
town or your
Yeah.
farming community or whatever. And
Hmm.
so information or news was always about something that really mattered because it affected you and your family and it invited you to do something, to respond thoughtfully. But media today is like I open my phone and within a matter of seconds, I could tell you in great detail what is happening on the other side of the planet. Now, that's important. I'm not
Sure.
saying that's unimportant. We have to live with an awareness of what's happening around us, but we get so drawn to what's happening wherever, and we put so much energy into like adding to the noise of
Hmm.
commentary, and all the while, like right here, the place you call home, in your literal home, or in your church, or your neighborhood, or your school, or your workplace, we just kind of go about our day in this like weird malaise, like, ah, yeah, this is just whatever. And then all of our energy goes towards stuff that like we don't really get to impact in a real way.
Yeah.
And so when we speak, we have to ask the question, like, where am I speaking? The most effective places that you can speak into that can enact real change are the places you inhabit, the literal, physical, geographic places you inhabit, the places where you have actual influence. Again, your family, your social circles, your church, your neighborhood, your school, your city, whatever, on and on.
Yeah.
And we bypass those things because we're so drawn to our smartphones and we just want to know what's happening in Europe or wherever, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
comment on those things. And so I think we have to begin there. Like where am I speaking? Because the place I speak from is going to have dramatic effect and impact in ways that just adding to the chaos and the noise on my phone is just not going to have. And so again, why do I speak? And really the answer for the Christian is like we speak good news. We are good news people. And
Yeah.
I think Christians so often don't do that. Like
Mm.
it's really sad to me culturally. Christians are people, at least in the modern West, we're the people known to be the most vitriolic and angry and whatever. And I don't think people assume that what we have to say is actually good news. It's just mostly bad news. It's mostly like what we're against rather than what
Yeah.
we're for. So I think we have to begin there. We speak good news. We're good news people. And then how we speak, like, are we speaking biblically? And by that, what I don't mean is using the Bible as a weapon to beat people
No.
up over the head and tell them why they're wrong. I mean, speaking biblically, like, how does the Bible speak? It speaks honestly, it speaks with compassion,
In
it
love.
speaks with truth, but it also speaks with grace. And so, yeah, a number of things there, but those are some thoughts initially.
That's beautiful. I cannot wait to get my hands on this book. The image that came to my mind when you were talking about where we speak is, are we kingdom building or are we building our own platform? Because there's a
Mm,
whole lot of us that are building these platforms for us to get up upon, and
yep.
that this whole platform branding, that drives me
Yeah.
crazy. It's
Yeah,
yeah.
it's good.
It's this is an I think the best part of finding out that you have written this book, and the reason why I'm excited to read it is because I think it's such a needed resource in our
Mm,
world, in such, like you said earlier, it's such a noisy world.
mm,
And thank you for giving of yourself that way. I know writing a
mm,
book is definitely a an act of sacrifice and service, because you're I know you said you needed it, but the rest of the world, you could have kept it to yourself. You didn't have to share it. So thank you.
mm. Gosh. Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate those words and um yeah, I do. It's an honor, first of all, to just even have a chance to create stuff for
Mhm.
other people. I don't take that lightly. And yeah, I hope it can help some people.
I have a sneaky feeling it's going to.
Mm,
Jay, you have been, it has been such a joy to just sit with you for a little while. I'm really
mm.
grateful we got to share some space. Please don't let this be the only time you come. I'd love to have you back again.
Yeah, I'd love to be back.
Anytime. Okay, good
Yeah,
deal.
thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it means the
Thanks.
world.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks so much for joining us. And good Lord willing, I will see you next week.